Two sisters, one man, a love triangle that turned deadly, shattering lives and leaving a town in shock. What drove these inseparable siblings to murder? Stay with us as we unravel the chilling story of betrayal, manipulation, and a rivalry that ended in tragedy. In 2022, the small town of Cedar Ridge was calm and peaceful. Everyone knew each other, and the Bennett sisters, Sarah and Emily, were well loved by everyone. But behind the town's quiet life, something terrible was about to happen. Something that would change Cedar Ridge and the sisters forever. Sarah, the older sister, was the more assertive of the two. With her strong personality and unwavering determination, she was seen as the protector, always looking out for Emily. Emily, on the other hand, was gentle and reserved, often leaning on her sister for support. Despite their differences, the sisters shared a deep, unbreakable bond, or so it seemed. Everything changed with the arrival of Michael Reeves, a handsome and charismatic man who quickly became the talk of the town. Michael had recently moved to Cedar Ridge to start a new job at the local real estate agency. His charm and good looks made him the center of attention, and it wasn't long before both Sarah and Emily found themselves drawn to him. At first it was harmless, innocent flirtations, casual conversations, and the occasional stolen glance. But as time went on, the sisters' feelings for Michael grew stronger, and what began as a friendly rivalry soon turned into something far more dangerous. The once inseparable sisters found themselves on opposing sides, each determined to win Michael's heart. On the evening of August 12, 2022, the Bennett house was eerily silent. The usual warmth and laughter that filled its rooms had been replaced by an unsettling stillness. A neighbor who lived just across the street couldn't help but notice the unusual quiet. Earlier that day, she had heard raised voices coming from the house, a heated argument between the sisters that seemed to escalate quickly. As the night wore on and the silence deepened, the neighbor's concern grew. She kept a close watch on the house, but there was no sign of movement. Unable to shake the feeling that something was amiss, the neighbor finally decided to call the police. When the police arrived, they found the front door slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. The officers entered cautiously, their senses immediately heightened by the ominous atmosphere that hung in the air. The house, once full of life, now felt cold and foreboding. The quiet punctuated only by the creaking of the floorboards underfoot. The officers made their way through the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. As they approached the living room, they were met with a sight that would haunt them for years to come. The bodies of Sarah and Emily Bennett lay motionless on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass and upturned furniture. The signs of a violent struggle were evident, with blood staining the once pristine carpet. The knife lying inches away from Sarah's hand was the final chilling detail of a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. Detective Laura Henderson arrived at the Bennett home shortly after the discovery was made. She was known for her sharp instincts and methodical approach, having solved numerous difficult cases during her career. As she stepped into the house, she immediately sensed the complexity of the situation. This was not just a case of domestic violence, it was something far more sinister. The first step in the investigation was to secure the crime scene. Forensic experts were called in to gather evidence, while the surrounding area was cordoned off to keep curious onlookers at bay. Detective Henderson knew that every detail, no matter how small, could be crucial in solving the case. As the forensic team began their work, Henderson took a moment to observe the scene. The bodies of the sisters were carefully examined, and the positions in which they were found suggested a brutal and desperate struggle. It was clear that both Sarah and Emily had fought fiercely before their lives were tragically cut short. The knife found near Sarah's hand was quickly identified as the likely murder weapon. It was sent to the lab for analysis, along with samples of the blood found at the scene. But what puzzled Detective Henderson was the question of motive. Why would one sister kill the other, and in such a violent manner? Or was there someone else involved? Someone who had a reason to turn the sisters against each other? The investigation continued with interviews of neighbors and anyone who might have had contact with the sisters in the days leading up to their deaths. The neighbor who had called the police recounted the argument she had overheard, describing it as intense and emotionally charged. She couldn't make out the exact words, but the tone of the voices suggested deep-seated anger and resentment. As the hours passed, the detectives began to piece together a timeline of events. The argument between Sarah and Emily had taken place around 7 p.m., according to the neighbor. By the time the police arrived, it was close to midnight. What had happened in those intervening hours? Had one sister snapped and attacked the other in a fit of rage? Or had someone else entered the house, taking advantage of the sisters' weakened bond? Detective Henderson was determined to find the truth. The longer it took to solve the case, the more difficult it would become to piece together the clues. But with each passing hour, the mystery only deepened, leaving the residents of Cedar Ridge to wonder what could have driven two sisters to such a tragic end. As the investigation moved forward, Detective Henderson turned her attention to the relationship between the Bennett sisters and Michael Reeves. It became increasingly clear that this relationship held the key to understanding the tragic events that had unfolded. Michael Reeves, the charming newcomer, had quickly become the focal point of the sisters' lives. Both Sarah and Emily were captivated by him, but their feelings for Michael had taken them down very different paths. As Henderson delved into their past, she uncovered a tangled web of emotions that had been building for months. Friends and acquaintances recounted how the sisters had begun to change in subtle ways after Michael's arrival. Sarah became more aggressive, not just towards Emily, but towards anyone she perceived as a threat to her chances with Michael. Emily, on the other hand, grew increasingly withdrawn, her usual warmth replaced by a cold distance as she struggled with the jealousy she felt towards her sister. What Detective Henderson found most concerning was the pattern of manipulation that seemed to be at play. Michael, it appeared, had been aware of the sisters' rivalry and had done little to discourage it. In fact, some suggested that he had even played into it, enjoying the attention and using it to his advantage. One particularly revealing piece of evidence came from a series of text messages found on Sarah's phone. In these messages, Michael had made subtle, flirtatious comments to both sisters, often pitting them against each other without their knowledge. He would compliment Sarah on her boldness while praising Emily's gentleness, creating a situation where both sisters felt they had a unique connection with him. As the detectives pieced together these interactions, a darker picture began to emerge. The rivalry between Sarah and Emily, once rooted in sisterly affection, had been twisted by Michael's actions into something far more dangerous. What had started as a competition for love had spiraled into a bitter struggle for control, with both sisters determined to come out on top. The more Henderson learned about the dynamics between the sisters and Michael, the more she suspected that the tension had reached a breaking point on that fateful night. But was Michael directly involved in the violence that ensued, or had he merely set the stage for a tragedy that he couldn't or wouldn't prevent? With the investigation now focused on the relationship triangle, Detective Henderson and her team began to dig deeper into the events leading up to the night of the murder. They discovered that the sisters had both planned to confront Michael on the evening of August 12th, each unaware of the other's intentions. Sarah had arranged to meet Michael at a local cafe earlier that day. Witnesses reported seeing the two engaged in an intense conversation, with Sarah appearing agitated and upset. Michael, on the other hand, seemed unusually calm, even distant. The exact nature of their discussion was unclear, but it was evident that something had gone wrong. Emily, who had been out of town for a few days, returned to Cedar Ridge that afternoon. She had been planning to tell Sarah that she was in love with Michael and that she wanted to pursue a relationship with him. What she didn't know was that Sarah had already confronted Michael and that he had rejected her. According to Sarah's closest friend, Sarah was devastated by Michael's rejection. She had always been the confident one, the sister who got what she wanted. The rejection not only wounded her pride, but also fueled a deep-seated resentment towards Emily, who she believed had always been the favored sister, even in their parents' eyes. As the detectives reconstructed the timeline, they realized that Sarah had likely gone home after her meeting with Michael, her emotions running high. Emily arrived home later that evening, completely unaware of what had transpired between Sarah and Michael. When she entered the house, she found Sarah in a state of emotional turmoil. What happened next could only be pieced together from the evidence found at the scene. The sisters' argument escalated quickly, their emotions boiling over as years of unresolved tension and jealousy came to the surface. The argument, overheard by the neighbor, was the culmination of months of rivalry, now inflamed by Michael's rejection of Sarah and Emily's newfound determination to claim him for herself. But as the detectives examined the scene, they found signs that suggested the situation might have been even more complicated than it first appeared. Forensic analysis revealed that a third person had been in the house during the altercation. A partial footprint found near the back door matched the type of shoes that Michael typically wore. This discovery led Henderson to a startling conclusion. Michael Reeves might have been present at the house during the sisters' final confrontation. But what role had he played? Had he tried to intervene, only to make things worse? Or had he been the catalyst for the violence that erupted? The presence of a third party opened up new possibilities in the investigation. It was no longer a simple case of one sister turning on the other. There was now the possibility that Michael had been directly involved in, or at least witnessed, the tragic events of that night. With the revelation that Michael Reeves might have been present at the scene, Detective Henderson knew the investigation was entering a critical phase. The discovery of the footprint at the back door had opened up a new line of inquiry, and it was now crucial to determine Michael's exact role in the tragic events. The detectives decided to bring Michael in for questioning. When he arrived at the station, he appeared nervous, his usual charm noticeably absent. Detective Henderson wasted no time and began the interrogation by confronting Michael with the evidence they had uncovered: his connection to both sisters, the rivalry he had seemingly fueled, and the footprint that placed him at the scene. Michael initially denied being at the Bennett home that night, claiming he had spent the evening alone at his apartment. However, when confronted with the footprint evidence, his story began to falter. Under pressure, Michael admitted that he had visited the sisters' home, but he insisted that he had only gone there to try and calm things down after learning about their argument from Sarah earlier that day. According to Michael, when he arrived at the house, he found the sisters in the midst of a heated argument. He claimed he tried to mediate, to get them to see reason, but his efforts were in vain. The argument escalated, and in a moment of panic, he decided to leave, fearing that his presence might only make things worse. However, Detective Henderson wasn't convinced by Michael's version of events. There were too many inconsistencies in his story: his sudden decision to leave, the lack of any attempt to call for help, and most of all, the fact that he hadn't come forward earlier. Why had he waited until now to reveal his presence at the scene? As the interrogation continued, Michael's composure began to crumble. He admitted that he had been playing both sisters against each other, enjoying the attention and the power it gave him. He confessed that he had known about the rivalry all along and had done nothing to stop it. But he vehemently denied any involvement in the violence that occurred that night, insisting that when he left, both sisters were still alive. Detective Henderson knew she had to tread carefully. Michael's admission of a manipulation was damning, but without concrete evidence of his involvement in the murders, it wasn't enough to charge him. Still, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, and Henderson was determined to uncover the full truth. While Michael's interrogation raised more questions, it also provided new leads for the investigation. Detective Henderson instructed her team to conduct a thorough review of all the evidence, focusing on any additional clues that might confirm or refute Michael's story. The breakthrough came when the forensic team analyzed the bloodstains found on the knife at the crime scene. Initially assumed to be from both sisters, a closer examination revealed traces of a third person's blood that didn't match either Sarah's or Emily's. This discovery was a game changer. If Michael had been injured during the confrontation, it could explain the bloodstains, providing a direct link between him and the violent struggle that had taken place. The detectives immediately ordered a DNA sample from Michael to compare with the blood found on the knife. Further analysis of the crime scene turned up another critical piece of evidence: a torn piece of fabric found caught in the doorframe near the back entrance. The fabric matched the type of shirt Michael had been wearing on the night of the incident, suggesting that he might have been in a hurry when he left, possibly after being involved in the altercation. The noose was tightening around Michael Reeves. The evidence was beginning to suggest that he was more than just a bystander. The blood on the knife, the torn fabric, and his own admission of being present at the scene all pointed to his involvement in the sisters' deaths. But was it enough to prove that he was the one who committed the murders? Detective Henderson knew that she had to build a solid case before making an arrest. The investigation had to be meticulous. Every detail needed to be accounted for. The forensic results from the blood test would be crucial, as would the analysis of the fabric. But even with this evidence, the question remained: what had really happened in the Bennett home on that tragic night? Had Michael been caught in the middle of a fight that spiraled out of control? Or was he the one who had finally snapped, turning the sisters' rivalry into a deadly confrontation? The anticipation was palpable as the forensic team completed the DNA analysis. Detective Henderson knew that the results could make or break the case against Michael Reeves. If the blood on the knife matched Michael's, it would be the first piece of direct evidence linking him to the violence that had unfolded in the Bennett home. When the results finally came in, they confirmed what Henderson had suspected. The blood on the knife was indeed a match for Michael Reeves. This revelation placed him at the center of the crime scene, not just as a witness, but as someone directly involved in the altercation. The question now was whether this involvement made him a participant in the murder or an unfortunate victim of circumstance. Armed with this new evidence, Detective Henderson brought Michael back in for questioning. This time there was no room for evasion. Confronted with the undeniable proof of his blood at the scene, Michael's demeanor changed completely. The nervous charm he had displayed during previous interrogations gave way to desperation. Michael claimed that he had been trying to protect Emily from Sarah's wrath. According to him, Sarah had been the aggressor, attacking Emily in a fit of jealous rage. He said he intervened to try and stop the fight, and in the struggle he was injured. Panicked and afraid, he fled the scene without calling for help, fearing that no one would believe his version of events. But Detective Henderson wasn't satisfied with Michael's story. There were still too many inconsistencies. Why had he kept silent for so long? Why hadn't he sought help after the incident? And most importantly, why had he continued to manipulate the sisters even as their rivalry intensified? Henderson pressed Michael on these points, but he remained adamant that he had not intended for anyone to get hurt. He portrayed himself as a victim of circumstances, caught in a deadly game that spiraled out of control. But the evidence was beginning to paint a different picture, one where Michael's actions or inactions had contributed directly to the tragic outcome. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Detective Henderson and her team continued to piece together the events of that fateful night. The evidence was compelling, but there was still one crucial element missing: a clear motive that explained why things had escalated to the point of murder. Henderson revisited the text messages and phone records from the days leading up to the incident. Among them, she found a series of deleted messages from Michael's phone that revealed a disturbing pattern. In these messages, Michael had been goading both sisters, playing on their insecurities and pushing them further into conflict. He had made promises to both Sarah and Emily, leading each to believe that she was the one he truly cared for, all while knowing that his actions were driving a wedge between them. It became clear that Michael's manipulation was not just a passive act of indifference, it was a deliberate strategy. He had been orchestrating the sisters' rivalry, enjoying the power it gave him, and perhaps even hoping to benefit from their downfall. But what he hadn't anticipated was how far things would go. In the final hours before the murders, Michael had sent a message to Emily, telling her that he needed to talk to her alone, without Sarah knowing. This message, coupled with the timeline of events, suggested that Michael had intended to confront Emily that night, possibly to break things off with her, or to escalate the situation further. The detectives now had a motive that fit the pattern of behavior they had uncovered. Michael had manipulated the sisters into a deadly rivalry, and when things got out of hand, he had been caught in the crossfire. But whether he had actively participated in the violence or simply allowed it to happen was still a question that needed answering. With the final pieces of evidence in place, Detective Henderson was ready to make her case. The DNA evidence, the torn fabric, and the pattern of manipulation all pointed to Michael's involvement. But it was the cumulative weight of the evidence, the long history of rivalry he had stoked, the blood on the knife, and the damning text messages that would form the foundation of the charges against him. As Henderson prepared to bring the case to a close, she knew that the truth was likely even more complex than the evidence suggested. The Bennett sisters had been driven to the brink by a toxic mix of love, jealousy, and manipulation. And while Michael Reeves had played a central role in their tragic end, the real story was one of deep emotional turmoil that had been brewing for years. With the evidence mounting against him, Michael Reeves was arrested and charged with the murders of Sarah and Emily Bennett. The arrest sent shockwaves through Cedar Ridge, a town still reeling from the tragic deaths of the beloved sisters. The trial that followed became a focal point for the community, as everyone sought answers to the questions that had haunted them since that fateful night. In court, the prosecution laid out a damning case against Michael. They detailed how he had manipulated the Bennett sisters, playing on their emotions and insecurities, and driving them into a rivalry that ultimately turned deadly. The DNA evidence, the torn fabric, and the deleted messages all painted a picture of a man who had used the sisters for his own gain, with no regard for the consequences. Michael's defense team argued that he had been a victim of circumstance, caught in the middle of a volatile situation that he hadn't created. They portrayed him as someone who had tried to de-escalate the conflict between the sisters, only to find himself overwhelmed by the intensity of their emotions. They emphasized that while Michael's behavior may have been unethical, it didn't make him a murderer. The turning point in the trial came when Detective Henderson was called to the stand. Her testimony was methodical and precise, laying out the investigation in meticulous detail. She explained how each piece of evidence had been uncovered, how the timeline of events had been constructed, and how Michael's actions had contributed to the tragic outcome. She spoke of the messages that revealed Michael's manipulation, and how his presence at the scene, combined with the DNA evidence, suggested that he was more than just a bystander. But it was the testimony of a surprise witness that truly sealed Michael's fate. Sarah's closest friend, who had remained silent until the trial, came forward with a chilling account. She revealed that on the day of the murders, Sarah had confided in her that Michael had threatened to expose Emily's secrets if she didn't break things off with him. This revelation provided the missing link, a motive for why Michael might have escalated the situation to the point of violence. The courtroom was silent as the witness described how Sarah had been terrified, not just for herself, but for her sister. She had been trapped, unable to walk away from Michael without risking everything, and this fear had driven her to confront him that night. The prosecution argued that Michael, realizing that he was losing control of the situation, had resorted to violence to protect himself. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Michael Reeves was found guilty of the murders of Sarah and Emily Bennett. The jury concluded that while Michael may not have intended for things to end in murder, his actions had set the tragedy in motion. His manipulation, his threats, and his presence at the scene all contributed to the sisters' deaths. The sentencing brought a sense of closure to the people of Cedar Ridge, but it was a bittersweet victory. The town had lost two of its brightest lights, and no verdict could bring them back. The Bennett home, once filled with laughter and life, now stood as a silent reminder of the dangers of unchecked rivalry and manipulation. Detective Henderson, reflecting on the case, knew that the story of the Bennett sisters would stay with her for a long time. It was a case that had challenged her at every turn, revealing the dark complexities of human relationships. But it was also a case that had reinforced her belief in the importance of seeking the truth, no matter how difficult or painful it might be. As the final chapter of the Bennett sisters' tragedy came to a close, Cedar Ridge began the slow process of healing. The community came together to support one another, sharing their memories of Sarah and Emily, and vowing to never forget the lessons learned from their story. For Detective Henderson, the case was a reminder of the fragile nature of trust and the devastating consequences that can arise when it is betrayed. The trial may have ended, but the impact of the Bennett sisters' rivalry and its tragic end would be felt for years to come. A cautionary tale of love, jealousy, and the human cost of manipulation.